Welcome to the Facilitators Deep Dive Podcast, your podcast on your way to facilitation mastery.
Welcome to this deep dive, all about the art of facilitation. Looks like you've been doing some serious research on this, huh?
Yeah, you've given me a lot to work with.
Books, articles, even personal stories about, presentations and working with groups. Ready to unearth some wisdom we can all use, like, right away.
Absolutely. And I think what's interesting is just how many of your sources really stress that it's about more than just, presenting information.
Right.
It's about the experience, creating something, where everybody feels like they're on the same page, feels understood.
Like that quote from Scott Birkin.
Yes.
Comparing getting ready for a presentation to rapid prototyping.
Yeah.
That really hit me. He talks about practicing like out loud, but not to memorize everything.
Right.
It's more about smoothing out how it flows, like testing a design,
It's such a good analogy.
Yeah.
It reminds me of, the so what challenge that Dr. Detterlane used to do.
But no, tell me about that.
He would always push his students to go deeper than, those surface level answers. So what? What does it mean for the people listening? Why should they care?
And that's such a good point to remember, even for like smaller things, team meeting, one-on-one. I was thinking about a recent project where I kind of jumped ahead to solutions before I really understood the problem. Could have used that so what thinking right then.
Definitely. It's easy to get caught up in our own ideas and forget to think about what the other people need, what they want.
Totally. Okay, so speaking of digging deeper, I noticed a lot of your sources talk about, strategically using why questions. It's not like an interrogation though, right?
Exactly. It's more about being curious.
Okay.
Figuring out those hidden things that motivate people, clarifying assumptions. There's this anecdote from Dana Chisnell about a user interview.
Oh, yeah.
She asks why. And ends up uncovering this really personal story from the participant. It totally changed how she understood the research.
That reminds me of this time I was facilitating a workshop and one guy was just like silent. So I finally said, "Why are you saying more? Is something stopping you?"
Interesting.
Turns out he had awesome ideas, was just afraid to share.
Wow.
But that one question, that's all it took.
That's amazing. It shows how much power a simple question can have. We're dealing with people, not just ideas. Their experiences, their perspectives.
And that actually leads perfectly into another theme that came up a lot, having a clear agenda.
Yes.
No matter what you're facilitating, it seems like an agenda is key. But I gotta be honest, I struggle with making them, engaging. They can feel so list-like.
I think it's about seeing it as more than just a schedule. It's a roadmap, it builds trust, sets expectations, shows everyone's on the same page. One of your sources had a good tip. When you're making your agenda, ask yourself, what will we accomplish? What will people actually produce? Documentation, time limits.
I like that. Makes you think about what you want to get out of it, not just the logistics. I think that would help me make better agendas for sure. But even with a great agenda, we all know there's going to be some interesting personalities to deal with.
Oh, for sure. And managing those personalities, that's a real skill.
Yeah.
Your sources have some great advice on handling, like, the boss type. The one who shuts down everyone's ideas with one comment.
Yeah. We've all been in that meeting where the energy just dies. So how do we navigate that danger zone when someone starts to, derail things?
One thing they suggest is addressing it head on, but privately. Pull them aside during a break. Have a real conversation about how their behavior is affecting everyone. You could even use why questions to help them understand.
Smart. I also noticed that the physical environment came up a lot. Not just about comfy chairs, it's creating the right atmosphere for people to work together and, be creative.
One expert even said, know thy room. Like, get there early, walk around, test the equipment, even clap your hands to hear how the sound is. Be in control of the space so you can focus on the people.
Makes me think of that story from Jared Spool. His laptop died right before a presentation.
Oh, yeah.
Definitely emphasizes needing a backup plan. Be ready for anything. Okay, so on that note of being prepared, what about practicing for facilitation? Seems like everyone's got their own way.
It's true. Some people like to script everything out. Others, they're more, go with the flow. But it's interesting. Experts like Eric Rice, Enid Bowles, Nathan Shedroff, they all say you have to really know your material, not memorize, but understand it, how it all connects.
It's like making it your own so you can deliver it confidently. Now, your sources get into specific types of facilitation, right? Workshops, brainstorming, focus groups. What are some key things our listeners should focus on?
Well, with those kickoff workshops, they really emphasize seeing them as a design opportunity. It's not just gathering info, it's setting the stage for the whole project.
That's a great way to think about it. Gives the facilitator more power to shape the outcome. What about brainstorming sessions? Any tips for like balancing structure with letting people be creative?
They say to provide just enough structure to keep things on track, but not so much that it stifles people. One expert suggests using visuals, like mind maps or concept boards, helps people see their ideas and how they connect.
Okay, and focus groups. They can be so insightful, but also hard to manage.
Right, they really emphasize creating a safe environment where people feel comfortable sharing honest opinions. And one expert even suggested role-playing to get people thinking outside the box, seeing different viewpoints.
It all comes back to group dynamics, huh?
Definitely.
So speaking of dynamics, what about one-on-one facilitation? Your sources cover interviews, usability testing, and mentoring. Key takeaways for our listener.
Well, for interviews, one expert said to think of your questions like a story. Create a natural flow instead of just like firing off questions from a list.
That's a good point. I get so focused on the script sometimes that I miss chances to go deeper on something interesting. What about usability testing?
Key thing there is managing interruptions. Let the person do their thing without interfering, even if they struggle. It's about watching them, not helping them.
So you see how they actually use the product or service naturally. Okay, and what about mentoring? It's the type of facilitation we don't always think about.
They really emphasize connecting with the person you're mentoring.
Right.
It's more than just giving advice, it's being supportive and encouraging, even when things are tough.
That makes me think of something I read about qualified versus unqualified support. Sharing your expertise is one thing, but just being there for the person, no matter what, that's powerful.
It really is. And your sources highlight how mentoring is about helping someone find their own way. It's their journey.
Right. You're more like a guide, not a GPS telling them exactly what to do. Okay, so let's move on to the big stage stuff. Conference presentations. Your sources are full of advice on stage fright, storytelling, designing those slides. What stood out to you?
The peak end rule.
What's that?
People remember the most intense part of a presentation and how it ends. So we need to create those peaks and valleys, those moments that grab them.
It's like telling a story. A good story. You remember how it made me feel? I also saw a few sources mention those leaners and nodders in the audience.
Yes. Those are your allies, the people who are really engaged.
Right.
Making eye contact with them can help you feel more confident and connect with everyone.
Like they're giving you permission to be your best self up there. Okay, what about panel discussions? So many different people and opinions all at once.
One expert said to think of it as a conversation, not a bunch of mini presentations. It's about that back and forth, building on each other's ideas, maybe even a healthy debate.
Makes sense. Creating a space for dialogue, not controlling it too much. Now, online learning is so big these days. Virtual seminars are everywhere. Any strategies for making them engaging?
One expert actually suggests using the limitations to your advantage.
Yeah.
Like instead of trying to make it like an in-person seminar, make it more immersive. Use sound effects, music, different voices, like a radio play for the internet.
That's so creative. Thinking outside the box. I also saw a lot about visual communication for virtual seminars.
Oh, definitely. Even though you're not there in person, you can still use visuals to keep people's attention and make it more interesting.
Right.
Slides, diagrams, things like that.
Makes it more visually appealing, even if it's virtual. What about lectures? Seems like they've gotten a bad rap lately, but your sources say they can still be useful if you design them right.
For sure. The key is to move away from that, sage on the stage thing and make it more interactive. Activities, discussions, chances for students to use what they're learning right there.
Make it a conversation, not a lecture, I would say. I had this one professor in college. He was a master at that. He'd throw in questions, little debates, even role-playing sometimes. Kept us all engaged.
That's a great example. And one of your sources talked about how important enthusiasm is.
Right.
If you're not excited about it, how can you expect your students to be?
Totally. It's contagious. You gotta let your passion show and get them excited to learn. Okay, last communication scenario I want to talk about is Q&A sessions. They can be scary, especially when you get tough questions or a hostile audience. What are some ways to handle those?
Stay calm, even when the questions are hard. Don't let a few difficult people take over. Gently redirect things, set boundaries, and keep it respectful.
Don't get pulled into a fight, right? I've definitely been there, and it never goes well.
Oh, we've all been there. Another tip was don't be afraid to say you don't know something. If a question stumps you, just acknowledge it, say you'll get back to them, and move on.
That's good advice. It makes you seem more human, you know? One expert even said to use those moments to ask the audience what they think, turn it into a strength.
Exactly. It creates that collaborative learning environment where everyone feels valued. Now, we've talked a lot about measuring success in facilitation, but your sources also warn about getting too obsessed with the numbers.
Like the story about looking for the mountain that moved, right? Sometimes the most important results are harder to measure.
It reminds us that facilitation is about more than just hitting goals. It's about connecting with people, helping them understand each other, and inspiring action. That stuff can have a huge impact, even if it's hard to quantify.
So how do we balance that need for accountability with, the fact that some of the best results are kind of intangible?
I think it starts with defining success in a bigger way. It's not just about specific outcomes. It's about making it a valuable experience for everyone.
So shift our focus from what we produce to what kind of impact we have. Okay, I think it's time for those facilitation horror stories you've been teasing.
Oh, yes. Get ready for some cringeworthy moments, but remember, we can learn from these too, what not to do right.
All right, hit me with them. What are some of the biggest facilitation disasters from your research?
This one really stuck with me. A facilitator was leading a brainstorming session, and two people started arguing, like really heated.
Oh no, that sounds awful. What did the facilitator do?
Well, instead of calming things down, they got flustered and spilled coffee all over one of the people arguing.
No way. Are you serious?
I'm totally serious. It was a complete mess. The argument got worse. People stormed out. The whole thing fell apart.
Wow. Good reminder that things can go wrong, even with the best plans. Guess we got to learn from those mistakes and try not to repeat them.
Exactly. And speaking of learning from mistakes, I think it's time we shifted gears and talked about some specific techniques and tools that can help you get even better at facilitating. But first, we're going to take a quick break and be back with the final part of your deep dive. Be back in a flash. Man, those horror stories, they're like a masterclass in what not to do. Sometimes you got to learn from other people's mess-ups, right?
Totally, like a crash course in how to handle a crisis. But before we get to those, let's shift gears a bit. Your sources also had some good stuff on, like, sales calls and mentoring. I think this is where it gets really useful for you.
Yeah, I agree. What I found interesting about the sales call stuff was that they really focused on building relationships, not just, making the sale. It kind of goes against that whole always be closing thing.
Right, like it's more like a first date, not a proposal. You're figuring out if it's a good fit, not pushing for a commitment. One expert even said to think of it as a problem-solving session, working together.
I like that. And it goes back to asking why. Really understanding what the customer needs and wants. That's how you build a connection.
It's about the relationship, not just the transaction. Okay, let's talk about mentoring. That's something we don't always think about as facilitation, but your sources really highlighted it. What were some key takeaways for you?
Well, that idea of qualified versus unqualified support really stuck with me.
Yeah, tell me more about that.
So qualified support is like sharing your knowledge, your advice, your expertise, but unqualified support, that's just being there for the person, believing in them no matter what happens.
It's about supporting their growth, even when they mess up. It reminds me of this mentor I had early on in my career. He always believed in me, even when I doubted myself. It made a huge difference.
It's amazing how much that can impact someone. It gives them the courage to take risks and, really reach their potential. And your sources emphasize that mentoring is really about empowering the other person. It's their journey, not yours.
You're just there to guide them, not tell them exactly what to do. Okay, so speaking of guidance, let's move on to conference presentations. Your sources had a ton of advice on everything from stage fright to storytelling to those slides. What really stood out to you?
One thing that I thought was really fascinating was this idea of the peak end rule.
Okay, refresh my memory on that one.
Basically, it says that people remember the most intense part of a presentation and how it ends more than anything else. So we need to create those highs and lows, those moments that really grab their attention.
That makes sense. It goes back to storytelling, right? Yeah. Good story. You remember how it made you feel. Yeah. I also noticed a lot of sources mentioned leaners and nodders in the audience.
Yes. Those are the people who are really into what you're saying.
Right.
Making eye contact with them can help you relax and connect with the whole audience.
Like they're giving you permission to be your best. Okay, what about panel discussions? You've got all these different personalities and opinions up there. How do you manage that?
Well, one expert suggested thinking of it more as a conversation, not just a bunch of mini presentations. It's about that back and forth, people building on each other's ideas, maybe even some healthy debate.
Yeah, creating a space for dialogue, not being too controlling. Now, virtual seminars are so big now with all the online learning. What are some good strategies for making those engaging?
One expert had this really interesting idea. He said to use the limitations of the virtual format to your advantage. Like, instead of trying to make it just like an in-person seminar, make it more immersive. Use sound effects, music, multiple voices, like a radio drama, but online.
Wow, that's a great idea. It's about using what you have in a creative way. And I saw a lot about visual communication for virtual seminars too.
Yeah, that's key.
Mhm.
Even though you're not there in person, you can still use visuals to keep people engaged and make it more interesting. Slides, diagrams, things like that.
It's about being visually appealing, even in a virtual space. Now, what about lectures? They've gotten kind of a bad rap, but your sources said they can still be a good tool if they're designed well.
Right. The key is to move away from that traditional lecture format and make it more interactive. Have activities, discussions, give students a chance to use what they're learning right then and there.
Turn it into a conversation, not just a lecture. I had this one professor in college who was amazing at that. He'd throw in questions, start little debates, even have us do some role playing sometimes. It kept us all on our toes.
That's a great example of how to bring some energy to that format.
Yeah.
And speaking of energy, one of your sources talked about how important enthusiasm is.
Oh, for sure.
If you're not excited about it, how can you expect your students to be?
Totally. Your passion is contagious. You got to let it show. Okay, last thing I want to touch on is Q&A sessions. They can be nerve-wracking, especially when you get tough questions or a hostile audience. Any advice on handling that?
One of the biggest things is to stay calm, even when the questions are difficult. Don't let a few people derail the whole thing. Gently redirect the conversation, set boundaries, and keep it respectful.
Don't let yourself get pulled into an argument. I've been there, and it's never good.
We've all been there. Another good tip was to not be afraid to say you don't know something. If you get a question that stumps you, just acknowledge it, say you'll look into it, and move on.
That's good advice. It shows you're human. One expert even said you can use those moments to ask the audience for their thoughts. Turn it into a positive.
Exactly. It creates that sense of collaboration and makes everyone feel like their input matters. So we've talked a lot about measuring success in facilitation, but your sources also warned against getting too hung up on the numbers.
Right, like that story about the facilitator searching for a mountain that moved. Sometimes the most important outcomes are hard to measure.
Yeah, it reminds us that facilitation is about more than just checking things off a list. It's about connecting with people, helping them understand each other, and inspiring them to take action. Those things can have a huge impact, even if it's not always easy to see.
So how do we find that balance between accountability and recognizing that some of the best results aren't so tangible?
I think it comes down to defining success in a broader way. It's not just about specific outcomes. It's about creating an experience that's meaningful for everyone involved.
So shift the focus from what we produce to what kind of impact we have. Okay, I think it's finally time for those facilitation horror stories you've been talking about.
Yes, get ready for some cringeworthy moments. But remember, we can learn from these too, what not to do right.
All right, let's hear them. What are some of the most memorable facilitation disasters you came across in your research?
Well, this one really stood out to me. It was about a facilitator who was leading a brainstorming session when two of the participants got into a heated argument.
Oh, that sounds like a nightmare scenario. What did the facilitator do?
Well, instead of trying to de-escalate the situation, they got flustered and accidentally poured a cup of coffee all over one of the people arguing.
No way. Are you kidding?
I'm totally serious. It was a complete disaster. The argument escalated, people stormed out, and the whole brainstorming session fell apart.
Wow, that's a good reminder that even with the best plans, things can go wrong. I guess we just have to learn from those mistakes and try not to repeat them.
Exactly. And speaking of learning from mistakes, I think it's time we shifted gears and talked about some specific techniques and tools that can help you get even better at facilitating. But first, we're going to take a quick break and be back with the final part of your deep dive. Be back in a flash.
Okay, we're back and ready to get into those specific techniques and tools, things you can use to actually improve your facilitation skills.
Yeah, let's get tactical. There's some really good stuff in your research that can make a real difference. One technique that stood out to me is the 5 whys.
Oh, right. I've heard of that, but I've got to be honest, I haven't really tried it. It's about getting to the root of a problem by repeatedly asking why.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
It helps you peel back the layers and understand the real reason something's happening, not just the surface stuff. You'd be surprised how often we jump to solutions without really getting the problem.
It's so true. We were having this issue at work with low team morale, and we kept trying all these solutions, team building, extra perks, but nothing was really working. If we had used the 5 whys, we might have figured out that the real problem was like a lack of communication from leadership.
That's a perfect example of how it can change your perspective and get to the heart of the issue. And speaking of shifting perspectives, another thing that came up a lot in your sources was visual thinking.
Visual thinking, you mean like using diagrams and sketches and things like that? I'm more of a word person, but I'm willing to try new things.
It's not really about being an artist. It's about using visuals to help people understand complex ideas, come up with new ideas, and make better decisions.
Great.
Mind maps, flowcharts, concept boards, really helpful tools, especially for collaboration.
Yeah, I can see how that would be helpful in brainstorming or workshops, especially for people who are more visual learners, right? It makes it more inclusive. But what about presentations? I've always heard you should keep slides simple, mostly text, so you don't distract people.
Simplicity is good, but actually, your sources suggest that visuals can really make presentations better. They can make your message more memorable, break up all that text, even add some humor or personality.
So it's not about getting rid of text altogether. It's about finding a balance, using visuals to support what you're saying. What are some good ways to use them?
One expert said to use images that evoke emotion or tell a story, not just illustrate an idea. Like instead of a generic teamwork photo, you could show a picture of mountain climbers, supporting each other on a tough climb.
That's a much better image. It makes you feel something. And sometimes the simplest tools are best, right? A lot of your sources talked about whiteboards, sticky notes, markers.
Ah, yes, the brainstorming essentials.
Yeah.
Low tech, but so versatile.
Right.
You could be spontaneous, work together in real time, and you have a visual record of everyone's ideas.
That reminds me of this workshop I went to where the facilitator used sticky notes to get everyone's ideas on this problem. Then we grouped them by theme and voted on the best solutions. Super simple, but it worked.
It's a great example of how those simple tools can really unlock creativity and get everyone on the same page. And speaking of simplicity, have you heard of the power of 3?
The power of 3, tell me more.
Basically, it's the idea that our brains are really good at remembering things in groups of 3. 3 wishes, 3 little pigs, 3 bears. It's a pattern we see everywhere.
I get it. So if we group our main points into 3s, it'll make our presentations more memorable and easier to follow.
Exactly. Simple but effective. And another tip from your sources, don't be afraid to use humor.
Oh, that I can get behind. I love a good laugh, but I'm always a little nervous about using humor in, professional settings. What if it's not funny? Or worse, what if it offends someone?
It's definitely a balancing act.
Yeah.
But your sources said that humor, when it's done right, can break the ice, make everyone relax, and help people connect with you.
So it's about building rapport and making your presentation more enjoyable. And I guess it shows that you don't take yourself too seriously, which is always a good thing.
For sure. Just be mindful of your audience and the situation, obviously. Nothing offensive or inappropriate. Speaking of connecting with the audience, one expert talked a lot about eye contact.
Yeah, eye contact is so important. But it can be hard, especially when you're presenting to a big group. Any tips on making it feel more natural?
One suggestion was to picture yourself having a conversation with each person in the audience, rather than talking to the whole group. It helps to create that one-on-one feeling, even in a large setting.
I like that. It's about shifting your focus, seeing individuals instead of just a crowd. Okay, last piece of advice that really resonated with me was asking for feedback.
Yes. Feedback is so important for growth, no matter how much experience you have. Whether it's after a presentation, a workshop, or even mentoring someone, asking for feedback helps you get better.
I used to hate getting feedback, but I've realized it's really valuable. Even if it's not always what you want to hear, it's a chance to learn and improve.
And sometimes, the best feedback comes from unexpected places. One expert said to ask for feedback not just from the people you're working with directly, but also from colleagues, even friends and family. They can see things from a different angle.
That's a good point. Be open to feedback from everyone and use it to become a better facilitator.
So there you have it. A whole toolbox of techniques and strategies to help you master facilitation. From asking the right questions to using visuals strategically to telling compelling stories, you've got everything you need to get started.
And like we've been saying this whole time, facilitation is a journey, not a destination. The more you practice, the more you try new things, the better you'll become.
And remember, every time you interact with someone, you have the chance to make a difference. By encouraging open communication, helping people understand each other, and working together, you can make the world a better place one conversation at a time.
So go out there and facilitate with confidence and passion. We can't wait to see what you accomplish. And if you ever find yourself in one of those facilitation horror stories, well, at least you'll have a great story to tell. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time for another exploration of, thought-provoking ideas.
See you next time on the Facilitators Deep Dive Podcast, your podcast on your way to facilitation mastery. Until next time.
See you then.